Hello, and welcome to On Point. I'm Jessica Harper. Every day for the last 488 days, Latora Green has held protests at what she calls the little corner of Big Change in front of a shopping mall in Sherman Oaks.
George Floyd! George Floyd!
After the death of George Floyd, Green founded an organization called the Valley of Change, inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. Her group's mission is to liberate Black people from the systems of oppression and brutality. The Valley of Change does this not only through daily protests, but by holding monthly community cleanups, organizing food donations, and giving away school supplies. What began as a protest has now transferred into a grassroots organization. Does the Valley of Change represent an evolution of the broader Black Lives Matter movement? On Point's Dominique Isabeau has more.
Thank you so much, Jessica Harper, for that introduction. My name is Dominique Isabeau, and today we have with us Dani Marzouca, who is a volunteer for the Valley of Change, as well as we have Keith Rice, who is an archivist and historian for California State University Northridge. Thank you both for joining us today. So my first question right now, I'm actually going to ask you, Dani. I want to know a little bit more about the Valley of Change organization, which we are going to be focusing on. What made you get involved with the Valley of Change, or how did you hear about them?
Yeah, sure. So I had been going to Black Lives Matter protests around LA, and as they were dying down in big numbers, in the 10,000 people march numbers, I checked out Together LA, which is an Instagram account that shares a collection of protests and mutual aid efforts around LA. And I noticed that there was a protest much closer to me. And so I showed up and I met Latora Green, and she was very welcoming, and I have just kept going back.
So what kind of events have you been involved with in terms of the Valley of Change and the different types of and things that they offer for activism?
So the Valley of Change is honestly doing it all, in my opinion. Latora Green is the founder and organizer and has been there every day for well over a year now. And on top of just going to that protest and being there holding signs, there are also Feed Our Friends events where we'll organize enough food, assemble it, and then outreach, like distribute, get in a car with a fellow and go and talk to our unhoused neighbors and offer them meals, offer them hygiene kits, and just make personal connections with our neighbors who we want them to know that we care about them. So we also include personal notes too, to let them know that we care about them. And they
Wonderful.
also do cleanups and many other events.
Thank you so much for that. So Keith, in terms of your beginning and starting in activism, Keith Rice, where did you first start in activism, or what is your first memory of your experience or getting into different types of activism?
I look at myself as kind of an academic activist. So it's recently started since I came back to finish my degree in about 10 years ago, my bachelor's degree and master's degree. And when I started working here at the Bradley Center, I started becoming more aware of the community needs. So everything I kind of do here in preserving history and history of underserved communities is what we focus on, is my activist work and documenting the protests that started last year in 2020. And I have photos of the lady on you mentioned her name, on Sepulveda and Ventura. I went up there twice and documented them.
That is so wonderful. So, was there a specific event? And then, Dani, I'm going to come back and ask you the same question. Was there a specific event in your life? You'd mentioned you'd gone back to school. Was there something that you saw? Was it a specific Black Lives Matter protest or something that kind of inspired you to begin archiving that?
It was a necessity. I would reach out to photographers who were going out documenting it, like when George Floyd was killed, and asking them to submit photographs. Would they donate their photographs to our institution? And I didn't think about it at the time. They're in the middle of their careers. Usually, photographers don't donate their archives until the end of their careers. So it dawned on me they're not going to do that. So I had a conversation with our special projects director, Dr. Stanford in Africana Studies, and she said, somebody needs to do this. And we have a great camera here. So I volunteered, and it's like, I need to do this. I need to capture this, and we need it here at CSUN so it can be accessed for the next 100 years. So people will know the truth. That's basically why I did it, so that they can see it from the people's level.
Got it. So, Dani, was there a specific event in your life, coming from the generation that you're in? Was there a specific event that maybe sparked your interest in activism, or did you just kind of fall into it? I know previously you had mentioned that you were attending like the Black Lives Matter protests here in Los Angeles. Was it the death of George Floyd that may have impacted you, or where did that kind of begin for you?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I wish I had a strong memory of when this started for me, but I've been involved in activist groups since high school, and I moved to Los Angeles to work for an animal rights organization. And I want to give a lot of credit to my the folks that I met there, because I feel we have marched hand in hand in many different protests and for different causes. So, yeah.
So I have a question for both of you as well, Dani. When you first heard of the death of George Floyd, how did that impact you? Did that immediately make you get up and begin protesting, or what kind of impact did that have for you specifically?
Yeah, I definitely went to every protest that I could, from small protests in Topanga where there were counter protesters, if you can believe, to the protests in Hollywood, the Black Trans Lives Matter protests. That time period, there was just a lot. There's just a lot of death in the news, and it's the most natural thing to be angry and express that. And being with other people who feel the same way, who are willing to fight to create a new world where this doesn't happen, is like the only comfort I think that I can gain from being a part of this movement.
Thank you for that. So, again, the Valley of Change, which is the organization that Dani volunteers for, that was directly created. Latora Green, having been impacted by the death of George Floyd, she went out and she began those protests. And then again, she created these other events in terms of a different form of activism, right? Like we'd mentioned, the Feeding Our Friends and the community cleanups, where she and volunteers will walk down Ventura Boulevard, cleaning up the streets. So we are seeing different forms of activism kind of take place, and have come about since the death of George Floyd. For you, Keith, what impact did you feel, or what feelings did you have when you heard about the death of George Floyd?
Um, you know what? This may sound strange, but I was not shocked, because I know that exists. And I was born in the late 50s, so I grew up in the 60s when King was killed, Malcolm X was killed, and President Kennedy was killed. So when you asked me that question about when did I become an activist, that may have always been in me, but it was always personal. I always took it personal as a Black man. But these events now, I have sons who in their 20s and 30s, and it impacts me more because I think about them and I think about other young people who are still going through the same thing. I've had my incidents with the police pulling me over for nothing, get me out the car, sit me on the curb.
Hmm.
Um, I remember Rodney King, and it was just to me a matter of time before we saw this happen on video. I, Unfortunately, I think a lot of Black people were not shocked.
So, the Black Lives Matter movement, has been around for a number of years. It sprouted off when Trayvon Martin, when there was an acquittal with that circumstance that happened. So the Black Lives Matter movement, has been involved throughout the years. When you guys, in terms of the more recent kind of upbringing of Black Lives Matter and where we're seeing that right now with George Floyd. When you guys see Black Lives Matter, what does that kind of mean to you, or again, your involvement with it? So, Dani, question for you. What does Black Lives Matter kind of mean for you?
So Black Lives Matter to me is like the baseline of justice for everyone, because I'll say, like, I have my own communities, like LGBT community, Palestine, Latino communities, and at the end of the day, like, as far as discrimination goes and injustice, that intersection with Black lives is always going to be, once Black lives matter, then really truly all lives will matter, because I see it constantly. And Black trans lives versus white trans lives have completely different morbidity rates, completely different experiences of homelessness, and it's just wild. It's just wild. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, Keith, to kind of change the question a little bit, in terms of your generation and where you're coming from, how have you seen Black Lives Matter kind of change over the years, or just activism in general? I know that we do have a series of images that you provided us from very early types of activism prior to Black Lives Matter. But before we prompt those, where have you seen kind of the evolution of activism, like leading into Black Lives Matter?
To me, there was a period like we have now, or like we had last year, was a lot of activity, and then, at least in Los Angeles, there was an event that took place where, after it was an incident at UCLA where a Black Panther was killed, or two were, things kind of, I don't want to say faded, but they kind of, were not as active. And I call that the end of the Black Power movement. I'm writing my dissertation now, and it was called originally The Rise and Fall of the Black Power Movement in Los Angeles.
Wow.
Then I had a conversation with Erica Huggins, a former Black Panther, and she asked me, why do you think it ended? And this is January of 2020. And she said, we were at UCLA, and she said, look at all these young people around here, talking about activism. And I was still a little skeptical, about changing the name. And then 5 months later, George Floyd, and you have all this activity. And to me, I look at it as it's an extension of what they started in the 60s. And it may have been, a lull in it for 20 years. Then you had, what's his name? 92. Rodney King.
Yes.
Then more activism, then another lull. And it seems like every 20, 30 years, it becomes really active. So it's an extension, to me, of what started 400 years ago when we arrived on these shores. It's always, you had Nate Turner, you had people always rising up physically, taking power. So it's an extension to me.
So we do have some images that you provided. I think you had mentioned you can give us a little background there. They're archived here at CSUN. We do want you to speak about those images. They are some historical images. If you could let us know, and we can kind of go through the different images and talk about those.
Okay. This is a photo of Malcolm X and John Shabazz. John Shabazz was the head of the Nation of Islam mosque here in Los Angeles. Malcolm X was heavily involved in starting that mosque for people who are, knowledgeable of the Nation of Islam. And speaking of George Floyd, in 1962, two gentlemen, members of the Nation of Islam, one delivered clothes, dry cleaning clothes to members of the nation at the mosque. He brought them because he knew he'd see the other members. He was exchanging the clothes outside of the car. Police roll up. They think it's, a case of stolen goods. They start, anyway, I'm making short. They get into altercation. 6 members of the nation were shot. 1 was killed. 1 was paralyzed for life. The articles read that it was a riot, it was a melee, that it was a shootout, and none of the members of the Nation of Islam had any weapons. One of the cops, his gun was taken by a member, but they didn't start with any of that. So Malcolm would come to those hearings about that case, and that's what this image is now. One of those visits when he was here about that.
So I think our next image is the great Martin Luther King. If you could let us know a little bit more about what we're seeing in this image.
The civil rights movement needed money. People were constantly going to jail. They had to raise funds to bail those people out from protests. This is May 23rd, 1963, 23rd to 27th. He was here earlier that day speaking at Wrigley Field. There used to be a Wrigley Field in Los Angeles, and it was used for the protests, concerts, minor league baseball, activities like that. So this is at an actor's house. Burt Lancaster and all these entertainers and civil rights activists were there raising money for the work that he was doing in the South.
Wow.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, so I think we have another image from the Watts riots. Is that correct?
Yes, that's actually the mosque. That's the Temple 27, Nation of Islam, during the Watts Rebellion. And the police, I remember this correctly, said they had news there was a sniper in the building or on top of the building or something like that. And they actually came and shot the temple up, LAPD.
So I think one of the final images is a burning building, if I remember correctly. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's an image of a policeman out there protecting, guarding the building and after it caught a fire. It's a basic image from the rebellion.
So this last image, if we could just talk very briefly about that, what are we seeing? This is, obviously I can tell this is a few years ago. I'm not quite sure the year this image was taken, but it looks like almost like our modern day protests that we're seeing right now. So this is something that's been ongoing for quite some time. What are we seeing in this image?
Actually, this is a protest against a developer who didn't allow African Americans to move into the development. And I can't see it, it's really small, but I think it's CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, doing this. Once upon a time, minorities couldn't live in certain areas, even in Los Angeles. And this is what they're protesting.
So questions for both of you now. So Dani, do you feel that, with this activism, throughout the years, do you feel that there has been systematic changes in oppression and racism? Obviously we have seen some changes. Do you feel that recently you feel that there have been any type of changes with the protests going on?
Yes, I believe protesting does create change. We saw that it took a whole nation to protest in order for George Floyd's murderers to finally be held accountable. And we also saw Governor Newsom sign an act that would allow police to become decertified and to get killer cops off of the streets. So we see that happening. We see, from Echo Park Rising, communities coming together to protect our unhoused neighbors. Like, we are able to actually protect them and more than that, I think seeing more visibility on the topic too. On the corner, while we see lots of hate, we also see young children bringing their signs every single day as they drive by, like putting their fists up in the air, screaming Black Lives Matter, and they're the same families over and over again. So we see the impact that just the visibility of this movement creates. And that said, it's not enough. I believe that real justice is abolition and discontinuing this PR stunt of viewing police as anything other than what they once were, which is slave patrol and protectors of property. So I have not seen any change coming from police or police unions, but I see the people creating change and holding police accountable. And I do believe that that people who have shed blood for this movement, and I believe that together all of that energy will end policing.
So, Keith, to ask you a question, do you feel that you have seen personally, just throughout your time with viewing different activism throughout the years, do you feel that there has been systematic changes in oppression and racism, and just recently with like the Black Lives Matter movement becoming a larger thing, do you feel that it is making a difference?
You know what? I don't think I can answer that question any better than Dani just did. It was excellent. I will add this. You can change things, on a systematic level, but you have to change the hearts, the minds of people. And Trump's presidency kind of showed that there are people full of hatred, and I don't even know why.
So, question: what do you feel that we can do to help, like personally, Keith? I know that you have specific work. You'd mentioned you have images of you going out into the protests when you heard about them in Los Angeles and taking photos yourself. And I know that you have some involvement with the Museum of Social Justice and some other things you're doing. What do you feel that us as individuals, like as a call to action, what do you think that we could do to assist? Is it us going out and taking our own images? Or what do you think that people can do?
Was to start, like myself, I didn't know a lot about Black Lives Matters. I was curious. I knew people involved in it before I started taking photographs. I And once I started going and photographing the protests and understanding what they stood for, I am a defender of them. And if I hear people, I'll hear people say something like, well, they're going to do this, or they want to do that, or they're against white people. And I'm like, if you've never been to a Black Lives protest, Black Lives Matter protest, don't say nothing. And that's not the word I use. Don't say anything. And I've had friends say that to me, and I'm like, no, if you haven't been, you can't say anything to me about them, because they, are not out promoting violence. When violence starts to erupt, they shut it down. I've documented it. I've seen it. And you know what? I think people during the when the protests were heavy, I think the most important thing people should have done or could have done was to go to a protest for themselves and get to know people. Because you sitting at home amongst your family, peers, and friends, there are people who don't know Black people, and there are white people who don't know white people. There are Hispanic people who don't know Black and white people. Before you say anything about anybody else, you better get to know those people.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciated that answer. And I know, Dani, you being heavily involved with the Valley of Change organization that does hold these daily protests, and again, we've mentioned they do have an upcoming event later, October 2021, regarding Feed Our Friends, which you can locate the Valley of Change information on their Instagram as well as their Twitter accounts. And finding that information. But is that how you feel that we can start giving back, Dani, is by joining like these grassroots organizations in terms of future generations, or how would it be best for us to help out? We do have about a minute for that question.
I would say yes, solidarity with Black Lives Matter, with these organizations, getting to know your unhoused neighbors who are disproportionately Black and Indigenous and people of color, and really just viewing them as people and getting to know them, stopping and seeing and staying by if you see a police officer pull a person over, I think that's also extremely important for us all to be doing, is to let the police know that we're watching them, and to turn anger into action by putting all that anger into something beautiful with the community. Like, go check out the Valley of Change. Come join us. We stay together, and it's a beautiful thing to get to know our community.
So I'd like to thank Dani Marzouca and Keith Rice for joining us today. My name is Dominique Isabeau, and this is On Point, and we will see you next time.
If I could go back and change it all, I would. I think I'm gonna miss you the most. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Or maybe it's just the little moments. If I could go back and change it all, if I could go back, I would. But I can't.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Julie was always a voracious reader. She'd carry 2 novels on an airplane because she'd read one on a 3-4 hour ride. And at some point, I began to notice that she would read a page and couldn't remember what she had just read, and she'd have to go back and read it again.
I don't remember much these days after I read, but less does for me, and I love it.
I don't remember how it started.
Go to that.
Our back and forth. It always came back.
Dad!
You probably don't remember what you told me,
That was perfect.
but I heard every word.
Thank you for watching On Point. You can watch us on Santa Clarita Valley Television and on LA 36. You can hear us on KCSN 88.5 FM on Sunday mornings at 5:30. And you can follow us on social media at CSUN On Point. For us here at On Point, I'm Jessica Harper.